Hey, good morning, guys. Glad that you're joining me again for None of These Diseases. We're getting into the second chapter. Again, this was written by S.I. McMillan, a medical doctor, a faithful Christian, back in 1963. The first chapter was on quarantine. We covered that. You can look at last week's lesson online. And really looking at the second week. And his channel for it was Pride and Prejudice versus Proof. I'm going to just retitle it and call it None of These Diseases, in the sense of just wash your hands. Isolation of, he says, from and of infection is simply not enough, because there's always some interaction. In particular, in his sense, he's talking about the interaction between a physician and the patient. And in that context, there's also physical contact. And because of that physical contact, you can spread things from one person to another. However, today, we're saying, hey, in social distancing, we need to really step away from that intimate contact, even if it's just a handshake. At first we were saying, well, we'll just do the elbow bump or the foot bump or do something like that, trying to get away from that contact. Now we're saying even that contact is not so good for us. But there are some people who think they're really practicing social distancing, sort of quarantine, by only meeting together with small groups, even if those small groups are just 2 or 3 people. But they tend to go from small group to small group to small group. And we're just hoping that they're practicing the washing between the two, any of the surfaces that there might be something that could get put on that one person could pick up from another, or always cleaned, whether those are or doorknobs or whatever they might be, books that are handed between each other. When I was out in California picking up Lauren, the store, they didn't even want to take a cash. Because something could be on the cash and handed from one person to another. So we're at a time where we're saying that the result of the spread of contagious diseases is something that we're seeing is taking its toll. I'm sure you're watching the figures, so I'm not going to go over those with you, but they are increasing. And they're increasing at a dramatic rate and at a time that's a little disconcerting for us. And so a lot of people who are really starting to say, well, maybe I need to be a little more diligent in this whole endeavor. Now, our good doctor here from None of These Diseases says that historically, the spread of contagious diseases has taken a huge toll. He gave the examples of cholera and dysentery and typhoid fever. And it really does. It's still spreading today. Because of my involvement with Haitian Christian Mission and going down to Haiti, it reminded me how back in 2010, for the first time in more than a century, there was cholera in the country. They hadn't had to worry about that. They hadn't to worry about that particular disease, and they were trying to figure out how they got it. They were able to trace it back to a UN deployment of certain guys. I think it was from Nigeria, and you'd have to check me on that. I could get the nation wrong on it. But it ended up that they brought it over from their country into Haiti. And then as they started interacting with people, it was spread. And it caused a terrible outbreak. And the UN, of course, did not want to admit that they were the ones who had brought it into the country. But in time, it was shown that that's exactly what happened. Even just this slight failure in cleanliness, of really washing, of being disinfecting, was able to transmit this disease that they hadn't seen in a long time. Hygienic provisions, Dr. McMillan says, even up into the 18th century, was nearly non-existent. And at least for me as a modern person, and I'm thinking about this, I'm just like, what were these guys thinking back then? The example he gave were in a lot of the larger cities of the time back then, that they would just take their excrement and they would pour it out into the unpaved streets at the time, because it was still a time when primarily they were using horses and the like. And the result of that, there's not only the stench, not only the flies, and the flies also causing some transmission of disease, but it just was a breeding ground for bacteria and for viruses and for obviously contact. Because people walked in those streets and they went around in those streets and they spread stuff from one person to the next without even fully realizing what they were doing. And a lot of people died as a result of it. He said, and I'm sure this is a pun not intended, but he said it was a waste of human lives because God's provision for free men from spreading diseases in that way was simply ignored. And you might be saying, what provision? He goes to Deuteronomy, the 23rd chapter, verses 12 and 13, which is sort of the standard for if you've ever gone camping. What do you do if you're not using the RV, if you're not using a camping area that has an outhouse for you? What do you do? Well, if you've ever been camping, you know that you pack a little spade. You go outside of the camp, you find a place that's away from everything else. You dig yourself a little place, do your business, cover it all up so that it's not going to cause a problem for anyone in any way. What it says in this scripture is whenever you sit down, you're supposed to go outside of your camp, and whenever you sit down, which I guess is the biblical thing, is that you shall dig with a spade and you're to cover it up. Just seems like common sense. But until plumbing systems were incorporated into cities, common sense certainly wasn't practiced. And it wasn't practiced because common sense was inconvenient. When you get a city and you get everyone together, getting outside of the city is not a convenient thing to do. You got to go way out there. What are you going to do with all this excrement that people are producing? Well, the solution back in those 1840 areas was simply to use a basin in the house for the washing and cleansing of yourself. Use a bucket or a basin in a chair that was designed for catching those things. And then how do you get rid of it? Just take it out and throw it in the street. Yeah, that was the right thing to do. And so he asked the question, how did Moses get an advanced idea of sanitation? And this advanced idea is just simply going outside of the camp 3,500 years in advance. And of course, his conclusion is that, well, maybe the Bible is inspired. Maybe God really was talking to Moses and giving him better directions than he learned from the Egyptians themselves. Which sort of brings to the question, why is common sense ignored? Well, his answer is pride and prejudice. Hope that you're having a good Sunday morning. I always teach with a cup of coffee, and so I'm still doing that today. And hope that you're enjoying this as well, and you're comfortable doing so. He gave the example of the Vienna Medical Center from the 1840s. And in particular, he drew attention to the maternity wards at the time, which sounded like a killing ground. He gave the figure of 1 in 6 dying. I don't know about you, but if I knew that the maternity ward had 1 in 6 people dying, I wouldn't want to go. I wouldn't want my wife going. I would say, hey, we need to do this at home. We need to get midwife. We need to avoid that place if the rate's 1 in 6. The doctors, of course, were contributing the mortality rate to constipation, to delayed lactation, to fear. They were dying because they were just so afraid. Poison air, which certainly could be something being transmitted in the air. But they had a lot of views, but the one thing that they did not consider is that they might be the very ones who are passing contagions from themselves and what they were doing to the next person. And so he goes into the procedure of the day. Because they had so many deaths, the first things the doctor did is that they would do autopsies in the basement of those in the morgue area, of those who had died the night before. And so they would do this procedure, which got to be a very messy, hands-on, involved kind of procedure. They would do that with their students, And then they would go upstairs and they would examine the living without washing. Now, to me, that's just unimaginable. But they would do that. There was a guy, and I'm not going to say his name right, Ignaz, Ignaz, Semmelweis, Semmmelwiex. He was put in charge of one of these maternity wards, and he observed the connection, the spread of disease between the physicians and their students, and so he required them to wash hands between the autopsies, and by the time they came onto his floor, his ward, they had to. Now, before he put this rule into practice, he had 47 patients who died, and that was weighing on his mind. How could he stop this? By June, only 1 in 42. So going from 1 out of 6 to 1 out of 42. By July, it was 1 in 84. And so, man, that was proof enough. This works, washing your hands. But there was a setback. They had one point where they had 11 out of 12, even though they were washing hands between autopsies and coming on his ward. And so he made a new observation. Perhaps, just perhaps, something deadly could be transmitted between the patient to patient to patient. So he put in a new standard. Not only did you have to wash before you came on the ward, but you had to wash your hands between touching each patient. Now, they thought this was going overboard. This was a nuisance. This was too much of this washing. I understand how they felt. My time at Emmanuel, I was working as a pastor on the ward as a chaplain at East Tennessee State Hospital on the pediatrics ward. And when you showed up there, you had to wash. You'd go into your office, and then before you went on the floor, you had to wash your hands for a long time, longer than I wanted to do. And this is before you had all those cool things on the walls to grab your hands and get cleaned up that way. But you would go in, you had to wash your hands. Then you would go in and you would counsel, talk, pray, encourage the patient. And then as you left, you were to wash your hands again. Then as you went into the next room, you were supposed to wash your hands, talk with the next patient, pray with them, wash your hands again. And you would do that all the way down the hall, all the way down back. And I understand. There was a part of me saying, this is just a nuisance. I mean, how clean can you get your hands? And so I understand why there was such a protest. Now, even there was a part of me that was protesting. I followed the rules because I did not want to be the one responsible for spreading something from one patient to another, even if they didn't have any signs or anything that saying that they might be able to have something that was contagious. So this doctor was belittled. He was told that he was a nuisance. He was making too much over nothing. And when his contract came around, it was not renewed. His successor was someone of the old boy club, I guess you might say. He eliminated all this hand washing nonsense. And as you might expect, the mortality rates returned to their old levels, back to 1 in 6. I just can't imagine that taking place, but it did, and it did at this hospital. He was not able to find a place anywhere because his reputation was, in a sense, sullied out of cleanliness, and so he went on to his home in Budapest. He did find a position there. He went through the same sequence. He instituted hand washing. He instituted hand washing between patients, and realizing that this was going to keep death rates down. And he was opposed. He was considered a nuisance. He was marginalized. He was ostracized. And in the end, he was taken away. And in the chapter, it says that the sad part of the story is that he actually kind of went crazy. He went into the insane asylum part of the hospital because he just couldn't bear knowing that there was such a simple treatment to save these people, and the doctors refused to do it out of their pride, out of their prejudices, and these ladies were continuing to die at an enormous rate. it literally drove him insane, knowing there was a solution, and the solution wasn't practiced, and he carried the weight of those deaths on his own conscience. So back to Moses. Given detailed instructions by God, which you can find in Numbers, the 19th chapter, especially in dealing with washing your hands after handling the dead. That's where that practice came from. You're going to be doing an autopsy. You need to be cleaning yourself before you pass something on to someone else. But in the 19th chapter, we find that the scriptures take it even further. It wasn't just to be washing in a basin, but in living or running water, so that just moves on and you're not washing your hands in dirty water. Not just once, but multiple times, even with a time of drying your hands between the washings. Not just washing the hands, but also changing the clothes. Not only just changing the clothes and giving yourself time, but even up to 7 days after contact. And there is a part of us that's just saying, that is just too much. It would certainly be too much in a medical professional area when the doctors are going to have to see multiple patients, which simply wouldn't work in a physician-patient kind of setting. But at the same time, it would absolutely keep contagions from going from one person to the next, from someone who's dealing with the dead and someone who's dealing with the living. And so the Bible was very far ahead of its day. And why? Well, we know why. It's inspired. We didn't have to go through practice and people dying. We could say, okay, God, we may not understand why you're asking this to do these things. It might be a nuisance to us, but we're just going to trust you. But we don't like to mix religion with something scientific like medical profession. And so even into the 19th century, the doctors were still holding on to practices that were transmitting diseases. Even into the 19th century, a normal routine was for a patient to come into the room, undress, climb onto the table on which he'd be worked on. The doctor would roll up his sleeves, not even necessarily having a change of clothes. They would get out their tools, either out of their bags or out of the cabinets that were there that they were in. They would invite their students to come in as they were dressed, and they would begin to perform the surgery. And all of them poke their hands, maybe inviting the students over to poke their hands in, and what would be, as he said, an otherwise sterile abdomen, if that's happened to be where they were working at. And so diseases continued to spread in hospital settings. And so it really wasn't, and he said, until 1876, until there was an antiseptic method of washing hands, which made the process a lot quicker, that it started being used. And even in the instruments then being also sterilized, that the mortality rates really began to drop. Now he credits a lot of the proof that these doctors finally began to accept were by John Tyndall, Louis Pasteur, Robert Koch, Sir Joseph Lester, and they established an accepted proof of the spread of diseases through contact. And that's why now in our time, in the modern times, we can't imagine a surgical procedure being performed without meticulous scrubbing. We couldn't imagine doctors going from an autopsy setting into a live patient setting without being cleansed and cleaned. And even the patient, for that matter, of making sure that they are cleansing and using sterilizers before a procedure is done. But he wrote this book in 1963. He said, but even when there are failures, disease will still spread. He cited a 1958 epidemic of staph infection in a large hospital on the eastern coast, in which, as a result of not practicing hand washing between patients, 86 men, women, and children ended up dying that were needless deaths. It was 1960 that finally a procedure book was being written about the importance of sterilizing your tools, washing your hands, which closely approximated the scriptural method back in Numbers, the 18th chapter. So we keep hearing, wash your hands, wash your hands, wash your hands. in our epidemic today, in the helping to keep CV-19 from spreading, and we need to do that. In fact, in our house, we even had a little discussion about the difference between using soap and using a beauty bar, and we found out that really a beauty bar can't be called soap because it's synthetic, and the FDA has a certain process that you have to go through to produce something that's called soap, and a different process for those things that are still detergents, still cleansing, but they're not a true soap in that sense. Also, if you're just looking for a little fun on these kinds of things and you need to teach your kids a little bit, you can go to a link. It's in the notes that you can get from our webpage for Baby Shark. You love that song. Hopefully it's not running through your head right now too much. Actually, I'm hoping it might be. But they changed the words about washing your hands and, keeping a little distant from one another. And if you're not into the kids part, you might be into maybe Neil Diamond. He took his song Sweet Caroline and he changed the words to it to talk about the importance of washing your hands. It's kind of fun in those things, but everyone's trying to get into this idea of saying, hey, it really is a good practice. They may not realize it stems from the scriptures originally, but it does. Again, from his chapter, we ask what is missing. And of course, the gospel is missing. The New Testament is missing. Just in case you're wondering, hope that you are, the New Testament has several words for washing in water. There's baptizo, which is talking about a full immersion. There's plano, which is, and I'm probably enunciating these things poorly, which is talking about using running water to wash. There's lutru, which is a bathing, which could involve immersion. It might be from the hips down, because that's what the Greeks sort of brought into them. They had hip baths. But they were also introducing mikvahs, which was a whole body bath in which you would baptize, but they would still call it bathing as opposed to immersing. And then there was nipsi, which is the most common word, in which you would just rinse something. You might rinse it by dipping it. You might rinse it by pouring water over it. But there are lots of them. When we were using this study with our young adults on Tuesday night, I said, hey, what's missing in the New Testament? And they brought up all the stories you think about. The ritual hand washing by the Jews, Jesus not following the ritual and addressing what needs to happen to cleanse the inside of the man instead of just the outside of the man. Mary washing Jesus' feet with tears, although the term washing, none of these terms for washing is used there, just the word that means to wet or really to moisten. Jesus washing his disciples' feet. Pilate washing his hands to rinse away his part in Jesus' death. And also some of the New Testament times, especially in Ephesians, where it says to wash away, which apoluo, to rinse away sins. Now, just as a little bit on that, because that was kind of some interesting things in there. In Mark, the 7th chapter, verse 4, whenever they noticed that Jesus said they didn't cleanse themselves, and they were just cleansing the cups, that he uses the word baptizo, the washing of cups and pitchers and pots, which was part of their ritual on it. Also, one of the terms for washing is whenever the disciples are being called by Jesus to follow him, and James and John are washing their nets, and that's that third planon. There's a flowing, rinsing kind of going on to get those nets clean. In Ephesians, as I mentioned earlier, 5:26, luturo, this bathing of being bathed in the water and the Word, which helps to cleanse us. And in Titus, the washing of regeneration or washing of renewal is also that bathing word, luturo. And the same way when it talks about, hey, sometimes the old proverb is true. that a dog returns to its vomit, and a sow, after washing, latruo, bathing, returns to its mire in it. And so it was sort of interesting to me to look at those passages and how the Pharisees, in particular, were requesting him to come and dine with them, and they were a little surprised that Jesus didn't wash before he came in to have the meal. And the word wash in that point is the word to baptize. And I thought, man, so is he talking about Jesus immersing before he came into the meal, and they were upset about that, or just the cups and utensils, or just washing his hands? What are they upset about? It's not completely clear, but it does use that word baptize. And so I said, well, I wonder what's going on here. And so I went to some Jewish sources to say, hey, what was the common practices back in ancient Israel? And they had started adopting baptism. They started building what they call mikvahs, which was not just the Greek hip bath, but they built these tanks where you had steps going down into it. Sometimes it was just steps going straight into an area where you could go down, stand in it, and you could easily immerse yourself into it. And so they did that a lot as their rites of purification. And in some of these wealthier homes, they had built these mikvahs. You didn't just find them at the synagogues. And it was a show of their spirituality that they would fully cleanse themselves in that way. And so they were really surprised about it. And so I think one of the things that's missing from this chapter is, even today, is that, yes, we need to make sure that we're certainly taking care of our excrement, and it's getting rid of it. I'm so glad for indoor plumbing, and want to thank all those people who have wastewater works and the cleansing that goes on, so we don't have to go outside of the camp and do it in that way. But we need to make sure that we're not causing a mess. And we may not be doing it so much, but if I walk my dogs every day, and I tell you, there are a lot of people who don't clean up after their dogs, and that causes a mess in itself as well. So we need to make sure that we have good hygiene habits in that area of our lives, but also with this idea of washing. We need to make sure that we are making sure our hands are clean. We're not spreading any of those kinds of diseases. But like Jesus, I think we need to remember that there are some other diseases that are being spread. And it's being spread from one person to the next as we influence one another. And I'm talking about spiritual diseases that are contagious, that are on the inside. And like Jesus referred to these Pharisees, what wasn't clean about them? They were prideful. They were prejudiced. They were also greedy. They were self-absorbed. And because of those things, they didn't have the compassion and the care, the kind of love that God wants us to have for one another, that moves us to acts of helps, where we come alongside one another and we engage in a way in which we help one another and we love on one another, and we are able to meet one another's needs, which was what Jesus was advocating. And he was looking at the lives of these Pharisees and saying, hey, you guys are doing well because of your rituals. You are taking care of the outside of the body. But man, the inside of you guys need to go through the same cleansing. And we know that Jesus is the one who can provide that cleansing. We turn to him. We come to him in repentance. We are bathed with him, united with him, and we are risen into a new life. And we come to him and saying, God, hey, I've been out of the world again. I don't want to be of the world. And I realize I'm starting to pick up some bad habits. I'm starting to bring some of those old things back into my lives, and I need to rinse them out and cleanse them out. And Lord Jesus, I need your help and your renewal to do that. And he has come to cleanse us in a way that we need. And so we'll end on that note. Hope that as you're going through this study with us, that you consider that we do need to be practicing good hygiene, but we also need to be practicing good spiritual hygiene. And we do need to wash ourselves with that redeeming word, that cleansing word bathing ourselves in it on a regular basis. Don't know how you're doing it, but I study the Word for practices and things. I've been listening through the Word, just audio versions of it, going through the New Testament, and I actually listened to the book on killing Jesus just written recently, and that was actually a pretty good study. So there's lots of ways for us to get into the Word together so that we can encounter God, so that we have that cleansing in our lives. Hope you guys enjoyed our study, and I look forward to our next chapter together.